We are on DAF Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph at the very top. We're starting the Gemara today. We had seen yesterday a Mishnah which had taught us a principle that if a person with his body blocks the doorway, preventing the deer from running out of the house, then he's done an act of trapping on Shabbos. He's done an act of tzad. But if you have Reuven and Shimon, Reuven sits in front of the door, blocks the doorway, and then Shimon sits in front of him, then Shimon has done nothing. Shimon's not doing anything wrong. And even if Reuven gets up, since the animal has already been trapped, by the time Shimon sat down, Shimon has no obligation to stand up anymore. He's fine. And the Gemara compares this to a case, the Mishnah had rather compared it to a case of a person who closes the door after the deer in his house or the animal in his house has already been trapped. Nothing wrong with it. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Rav, Nichmasa lo tzipor tachas kenavav, Yoshev u'mishamro ad shetechshach. That if a bird flies into my coat on Shabbos and gets trapped, I have no obligation to release the bird from my coat. I can leave it there until after Shabbos, no problem. Because the bird trapped itself, I didn't do anything, so I have no obligation to untrap it because I haven't done a Maisa, so I'm fine. So Masav Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Yoshev Harishon ala Pesach u'mil'ehu Ba Hashenu v'Yoshev b'tzido Afal Pisha Amad Harishon v'Halach lo Harishon Chayev v'Hasheni Potter. So now we cite the Mishnah as a challenge to that statement. The Mishnah had said that the second guy, Shimon, who sits in front of Reuven after Reuven has already blocked the door, is Potter. He hasn't done anything wrong. So Ma'alav Potter of Alasar. The word Potter usually means that he's exempt from any penalty because he hasn't done an Isser Deoraisa. But the word Potter still implies that there's an Isser Derabanan involved. So how can you tell me that it's perfectly mutter for me to keep the bird trapped? Shouldn't it at least be rabbinically required to release the bird? So the Gemara says, Lo, Potter u mutter. No, says the Gemara, Potter in the case of our Mishnah is a special case. Not only does Potter mean that there's no Isser Deoraisa, but it even means that there's no Isser Derabanan at all. And Shimon is allowed to remain sitting there even after Reuven has left. He doesn't have to stand up. Hachanami mistavra, it's logical to conclude this, midikatani seifa lamazeh doime linoel esbeis l'shamav nimtzas vishamar b'sochel michlal de Potter mutter shmamina. The Gemara says the fact that the Mishnah analogizes the case of Reuven and Shimon to a case of a person who closes his door after an animal has already been trapped in his house shows me that even lechatchila it's mutter for Shimon to remain seated. And the reason is because the analogy is to a very commonplace occurrence. No one would suggest that after I've trapped an animal in a cage in my house, I'm not allowed to close the front door. Of course I am. So therefore the fact that that's mutter lechatchila, and that's the analogy in our Mishnah, then it indicates that even lechatchila it's permitted for Shimon to remain seated, remain in his seat, and he doesn't have to worry about standing up just because Reuven has left. And therefore the same thing would be true in a case of where the bird has already been trapped. I have no requirement to release the bird. Ikada Amri, others learned that the shackle of Ataria was slightly different. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak af ananami tanina, to support the contention that once the bird flies into my coat, I don't have to release it. So this has been taught in our Mishnah because it says Afal Pisha Amad Harishon v'Halach lo Harishon Chayev v'Hasheni Potter. That even though Reuven has stood up, Shimon is allowed to remain seated and blocking the doorway. There's no problem. He's Potter. So my love Potter mutter, and that implies that Potter means that he's exempt and it's permitted for him to do so, and therefore that's a proof to the case of the bird. The Gemara says, Lo, maybe no, because Potter of al-Asr, because maybe the word Potter in our Mishnah means he's Potter from the Malacha Deoraisa, but it's still Asr Midrabanan. But wait a minute, says the Gemara, Hamidikatani Seifa Halamaz Doima Lenoel Esveisa Lashama Vanimsis Vishamar Bisocha Michal de Potter Mutter Shmamina. But the Gemara says no, that we have to retract as well. The very fact that the analogy in our Mishnah is to a case of where the animal is already trapped and I'm allowed to close my door indicates that the word Potter doesn't just mean Potter b'di'evid, but it's still Asr midirabanan, but rather it means that it's even mutter lechatchila because there's no Isser derabanan at all, and it's completely permitted for me to remain seated and to keep the bird trapped under my coat. Okay, so it's basically the same conclusion. It was just a slight shift in the cadence of the discussion. Omar Shmuel kol peturei de Shabbos potter aval asur lebar bahani tlos de potter umutter. Shmuel now says, anytime you find the word pater used in regard to, as a halachic word regarding the laws of Shabbos, it generally means that you're pater from having committed an Isser D'Oraisa, but there's still an Isser D'Rabbanan that remains in place, with the exception of three instances where the word pater means that it's even mutter lechatchila, there's no Isser D'Rabbanan at all. What are those three cases? Chadaha, one is our case that we just mentioned. Umimai de pater mutter de katani seifel amazidam lenoel esbeis l'sham avnimsa shvishar b'socha. And as we just proved, how do we know that the word pater in our Mishnah means that it's even mutter lechatchila? Because the analogy is to a completely mutter situation where it's mutter for me to close the door in my house once the animal is already trapped. So too, when the Mishnah says pater, in the case of Reuven and Shimon, it's perfectly mutter for Shimon to remain seated. Second case, the idach hamefis morsa b'Shabbos im lasos la pechayev im lahosim imenu leicha pater. There's a Mishnah that says that if a person pinches or squeezes a pimple on Shabbos, then it depends whether he's going to be chayiv or pater in that scenario. If he is squeezing the pimple in order to create an opening at the head of the pimple, and it was considered to be therapeutic to open up the pimple so that after you squeeze out the pus, you create an air window to allow air to come in and out, to circulate in the pimple. I'm trying to think of the technical term for a pimple.
It's boiled.
Whatever. Yeah. No, it could be a pimple also, but it's considered to be therapeutic to allow the air to air through and dry it out and to heal it. So if that's your objective, so then you're going to be chayiv, because that's a malacha of bona. You're constructing an opening, an aperture where one previously did not exist. If, however, your whole objective is to get the pus out of the pimple and you don't care about creating that aperture, so then you're going to be pater. And there, says the Gemara, the word pater means that it's even mutter lechatchila to squeeze a pimple on Shabbos. This is how we paskin lahalacha in Shulchan Aruch, that you're allowed to squeeze a pimple to get pus out on Shabbos, provided that it's not a psik reisha, that the pimple will bleed. So there are times when kids have acne, and it's a severe case of acne, so whenever they squeeze a pimple, there's bleeding, then it's not permitted to squeeze pimples on Shabbos. But if you have a very sort of a dry pimple, and it's just pus, and there's no bleeding, and you don't anticipate any bleeding, so then it's even mutter lechatchila to squeeze out the pus.
Rabbi, have we been talking all the way along through this whole thing about the concept of mutter, and that we've been trying to find, we're saying you're chayav or you're pater. Has it always been around this issue of the Rabbanan, like teasing out that issue of Isser D'Rabbanan, and therefore you don't have to bring a korban?
No, the word pater means you're exempt from a korban, exactly. Which means you have not committed an Isser D'Oraisa.
Right.
However, by inference, by saying that you're exempt from a korban, there seems to be some issue that they're still problematic with.
Right.
And that's the Isser D'Rabbanan that we're dealing with over here.
Right. Now, if you bring in all those cases we've dealt with all the way along until now, where you are, you don't have to be korban, you're not chayav, you're pater, but there's an Isser. So what do you do about? How do you rectify that problem? Just with tshuva?
What do you mean? How do you rectify?
Well, you can't bring a korban.
You mean if I violate an Isser D'Rabbanan, how do I rectify it? I rectify it with tshuva, just like any other.
Right.
If I eat pig, right, there's also no korban.
Uh-huh.
There's a way to rectify it if there's a beis din, which is with lashes. Today, if I'm in Mechalel Shabbos, even D'Oraisa, how do I rectify it? I can't bring a korban. But I do tshuva.
But back then,
but back then, there's also no rectification.
Even a beis din.
Well, it depends. There are certain instances where the Gemara says that if a person violates rabbinic ordinances b'mezid, we can, at the discretion of the beis din, give him what's called makas mardus, which is disciplinary lashes, at the discretion of the beis din. But that's not a Torah law. That's a rabbinic law of exercising a disciplinary action on the community to submit to rabbinic authority.
But b'shogeg nothing.
B'shogeg nothing. Okay. So now the Gemara asks, Umimai de pater mutter. How do you know that it's mutter to squeeze a pimple, even though it just says the word pater. Ditnan, I'll prove it to you because there's another Mishnah that says machat shel yad lital bo hakotes, because there's a Mishnah that says that you're allowed to use a stitching needle in order to remove a splinter on Shabbos. So it's the same principle of removing something from your body that is an irritant. So if I can remove a splinter lichatchila, I can also remove pus lichatchila from my body.
I think, Rabbi, that there would be a word other than pater that they could use so you wouldn't have this confusion about what is meant by pater in one situation versus another.
Why? If the word pater in all of Shas means that there's still an Isser D'Rabbanan, so then it's the concise, appropriate word to use. It's a legal term.
But here we're saying pater doesn't mean that.
In 3 places in all of Hilchas Shabbos. So you have 160-something blot of halacha, and in only 3 instances the word pater is an exception. I think that's an appropriate terminology then. V'idach, the third case is hatzad nachash b'Shabbos, that if a person traps a snake on Shabbos, im misasek bo shelo yishachenu pater, im l'refua chayav. So if you're trapping the snake to prevent it from biting you, so then you're pater. If you're trapping the snake in order to be able to harvest its venom for therapeutic purposes, so then you're going to be chayiv, because that's the type of trapping for which the Torah says is usher when you want the animal. But if you're doing it to avoid injury from the animal, so then you're pater. There too, pater doesn't mean that you're exempt, but it's still usher. Pater over there means it's even mutter to trap a snake. Umimai de pater umutter. How can I prove that to you? Didnan kofin kar al anir bishvil shelo techos bekora ve'al tzoa shel katan ve'al akrav shelo tashuch. There are 3 halachas that are listed in a Mishnah. You're allowed to take a bowl on Shabbos to cover over a candle, or to place it above, suspended above a candle to prevent the candle from igniting a ceiling beam. You're allowed to take a bowl and cover it over a child's excrement if the child poops on the floor on Shabbos. So even though the excrement may be muktzah, but you can still cover it. And then the third thing that you're allowed to do is that you're allowed to take a bowl and cover a scorpion to prevent it from biting. So you see that it's even mutter lechatchila to trap an animal to prevent it from harming you. And like I mentioned yesterday, when you're sitting in the sukkah, many poskim say that if there are bees or wasps, even though normally trapping insects is aser, at least in Isser D'Rabbanan, it's mutter in a situation when they are menacing to you and you're worried that they may cause harm. Yes?
In the other previous example of the deer running into the house, and then you're allowed to close the door and you're pater.
Yeah.
I don't understand. Doesn't closing the door mean now for sure it can't get out?
No, the animal's been trapped already. The animal's been trapped already. It's in a cage in your house.
Oh, in a cage.
Yeah, it's already been trapped. Okay? All right. I'm not taking any more questions because it's getting late. So hold your questions until Sunday, or ask them to Rabbi Turchiner. But we're now going on to the new parak. We're just going to go straight through now. Hadron halacha oreg. Next, Shmona shratzim ha'amurim b'Torah. There are 8 shratzim, the famous 8 shratzim, that when they die, their carcass conveys ritual tumah, right? So hatzadan v'hachovel bahem chayav. So if you trap these animals, or if you create an injury in the animal, which means that you puncture it or you bruise it in some way, so then you're going to be chayav for doing a malacha called chabala. Now the question is, what is this malacha? In other words, what rubric under the 39 malachas of Shabbos does it fall under? Rashi brings 2 different opinions. One opinion of Rashi is that it's a tolda of shchita, that it's a form of slaughter, and slaughter is the removal of life from the animal. This is a partial removal of life because you're shedding its blood or its life force. And therefore, even though you're not killing it, you've still done a malacha of shchita in the sense that you've caused some of the animal's health to be compromised. And that's true whether you break the skin or you don't break the skin, because even when you don't break the skin, you cause a bruise which causes the blood to be dislodged from its normal place. That's one opinion in Rashi, and that's what Tosfos subscribes to. The second opinion in Rashi is that you're dyeing the animal's skin by inflicting it with an injury. Because by causing its blood to be dislodged and flow up into the dermis, you're changing the color of the animal's hide, and as a result it's a malacha of tzoveya. It's a malacha of dying. Someone asked me a very legitimate question this morning. Why isn't this called the malacha shenetzricha legufa? That's not your objective, so why is that considered, why, at least according to Reb Shimon, should that be called the malacha? I told him I didn't know. It's worthwhile researching it. The only thing that I can think of is that it's useful to a person to have the color of the skin enhanced by the blood, and therefore maybe it's not called the malacha shenetzricha legufa. But we're not going to go weiter. Ushar shkatzim uramashim, other insects, hachoyvel bahen pater. Then if you injure them by bruising them or puncturing them, you're going to be pater. Now, why is that? Because other insects and crawling creatures don't really have a skin. And therefore, the form of injury that you're inflicting upon them is not considered to be the displacing of their blood. They have like an exoskeleton, these crustaceans, and therefore it's not really considered to be a skin that they have. And therefore, the malacha of choyvel does not apply to them. And so therefore you're pater. Hatzadan litzorech chayiv shelo litzorech pater. But by trapping other crawling creatures like insects and other small creatures, if you're trapping them because you want to harvest the animal for some benefit, so then you've done a malacha, and like we've said all along. And if you're doing it to avoid the animal, to avoid injury from the animal, or they just gross you out, so then you're pater. Okay. Chayav ha'of shebirushuso. If an animal and a bird are already trapped within your purview, hatzadan pater, then trapping them further, you're pater. V'hachoyvel bahen chayav. But if you injure them, you're going to be chayav. If you injure them, so then you've created, it's an animal with a hide, and therefore they're subject to chabala, to choyvel, and therefore you're chayav. So the Gemara now makes an inference. Midiketani hachoyvel bahen chayav michlal di'islahu or. The Mishnah says that the Shmona Shratzim enumerated by the Torah are subject to the malacha of chabala. That must imply that they have a skin, because as we've said, the general rule is that any animal that has a hide or a skin is subject to the malacha of chabala. So you're telling me that the Shmona Shratzim that are listed by the Torah all have skins. Mantana, who's the author of our Mishnah? Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. It must be according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because the Tanan Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, Shmona Shratzim yesh lehen oros, that all 8 Shratzim enumerated by the Torah all have skin. Now, we have to realize that when Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri made that comment, he was not speaking in the context of the laws of Chovel for the Malacha of Shabbos. What he was talking about is that what if you isolated just the skin of a sheretz and the actual body of the sheretz is not present? Does the skin transmit tumah? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says it doesn't, because the skin is distinct from the rest of the body of the sheretz, and therefore it does not transmit tumah. Only the body of the sheretz transmits tumah, but not its hide, not its skin. That's what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was saying. But we make the application that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri could say that by all 8 shratzim in vis-a-vis the laws of tumah, then we transfer it to the laws of Shabbos as well. Rabbi bar Avhuna Amar Rav afilu tema rabbanan, and he says no. Rabbi bar Avhuna, in the name of Rav, says I disagree. Even though the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and they say that only 4 out of the 8 shratzim have separate and distinct skins, and the other 4 do not, that's only vis-a-vis the laws of Tumah. Ad kan lo pligi rabbanu leid Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri ala le'inyan Tumah. D'chsiv eila hatimeim lachem l'rabbos she'orosein kibesaran. Because the Chachamim's whole basis for disagreeing with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri vis-a-vis the laws of Tumah has to do with a pasuk. The pasuk says, after enumerating 4 out of the 8 shratzim, it says, eila hatimeim lachem. The totality of these animals are tamei for you, which means that both their skin and their bodies transmit tumah, because we don't view their skins as being separate and distinct from the actual animal. And that's on that basis they disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Inyan Shabbos afilu rabbanan modu. But when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, the Chachamim agree that physiologically these animals do have hides. It's just that their hides, for the purposes of Tumah, are not distinct because of the pasuk. But as far as the laws of Shabbos, all of these animals are still subject to Chabala because they all have skins. And therefore, according to Rav, our Mishnah goes according to the Rabbanan as well as Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So now the Gemara asks, Uli Inyan Shabbos lo pligi? You mean to tell me that they don't disagree as far as the laws of Shabbos? V'hatanya hatzad echad mishmona shratzim hamurim b'Torah hachovel bohen chayiv di Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Brisa says that if you trap one of the 8 shratzim, or if you injure one of the 8 shratzim, then Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says for all 8 you're chayiv for the act of chovel. And the Chachamim say ein or ela lema shemanu Chachamim. And the Chachamim say no, that the only shratzim that have a hide are those that are enumerated by the Mishnah before the words Eila Hatmeim Lachem, that the Chachamim distinguish and say that these animals are different, right? So the Gemara says, wait a minute, before we even get to the question, Adarabba, Lema Shemanu Chachamim Ein Lahem Or. Don't you mean to say in the Brisa that the ones enumerated by the Chachamim, because they're identified in the pasuk as Eila Hatmeim Lachem, are the ones that don't have skin? Because the Torah says that the totality of these creatures, including their skin, transmits tumah. So don't you mean to say that they don't have a distinct skin? So va'amar Abaye hachi kamar. Abaye answers it by saying, Ein or chaluk mi basar. That what the Chachamim mean to say is that Ein or chaluk mi basar elalama shemanu Chachamim. Elama shalomanu Chachamim. Excuse me. That the skin is not distinct from the flesh, except for those that were not enumerated by the Chachamim in the Mishnah. So you have to just put the word lo instead of lama shemanu Chachamim, lama shalomanu Chachamim. That's how Abaya clarified it. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rava ha lama shemanu Chachamim kamar. He says, Rava says that's a stretch. If the Brisa says lama shemanu Chachamim, how can you just add the words Ela lama shalom manu? It doesn't say shalom manu. You can't put the word no if it wasn't originally there. Ela amar rava hachikamer. But rather you have to explain the Brisa as follows. Ein or mitame kibasar ela lama shemanu chachamim. That when the chachamim say that skin only transmits tumah as much as the flesh, with the 4 shratzim that were enumerated by the Mishnah. Which means that the Chachamim say that those 4 are considered to have no skin. So Michlal de Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, and basically using Rava's answer, we've also defended Rav's position. When Rav says that there's no machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbos, that all of these 8 shratzim have skins, that's true. What about the Brisa, which seems to indicate that the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbos? No. When the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, they're only disagreeing as far as the laws of Tumah. Ein or mitame kebasar ela lama shemanu Chachamim. But as far as the laws of Shabbos, they still agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that all 8 are subject to the law of Chabala because all 8 of them have skin. So now the Gemara says, Michlal de Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Hanach nami, de lo manu Chachamim mitamein. Are you suggesting that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because the language of the Brisa seems to indicate that no, we as the Chachamim argue with you, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and we say that the only time that an animal's skin transmits, the sheritz's skin transmits tumah, is only by the 4. So are you suggesting that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that language implies that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that all 8 shratzim skin transmit tumah, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri has told us just the opposite, that all 8 shratzim skins do not transmit tumah. But the language that you've just explained in the Brisa seems to argue that according to the Chachamim, only 4 of the shratzim skins transmit tumah, which implies that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, all 8 transmit tumah, and that's just the opposite. So v'hakatani Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri omer ches shratzim yesh lahem aros v'lo mitamin. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says just the opposite, that all 8 shratzim skins do not transmit tumah. So Ella Amar Avada Bar Masna Teritzach. You explain the Brisa as follows: the Chachamim Omrim leInyan Tumah Ein or lema shemanu chachamim. That the chachamim say that when it comes to the laws of tumah, the only ones that are considered to not have skin is le'inyan tumah ein or lema shemanu chachamim. That there is no skin to those animals that were enumerated by the chachamim, and even though according to you, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, all 8 shratzim have skin, and therefore their skins do not transmit tumah, we hold that they do not have skin, the 4 that are enumerated by the Mishnah. So the Gemara now says, so basically we have a resolution. There's no machlokus as far as the halacha of Shabbos, but the machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim is exclusively having to do with the laws of Tumah, that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, all 8 shratzim skins do not transmit Tumah independently of their bodies, and according to the Chachamim, 4 do and 4 don't. I know it's confusing, the Shakla V'Tari, but that's why I'm just reviewing it. That's basically where we are at this point. Va'akati le'inyan Shabbos lo pligi, you mean, are you sure that there's no machlokas vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbos, that both according to the Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, all 8 shratzim are subject to chovel? V'hatanya hatzad echad mechesh shratzim hamurim b'Torah, and hachovel bahen chayiv. It says that if a person traps or a person injures any one of the 8 shratzim, then you're going to be chayiv. B'shratzim sheish lein oros, but that's only true with shratzim that have skin. Bezohi chabura she'ena choseres nitzrar hadam afal pi shelo yatsa. And what is the definition of a chabura for which you're chayiv for? Any time that there is a dislodging of blood, for which the blood collects in a place where it's not normally found in the body, that's called a chabura. And when it says eina choseres, means it doesn't get reabsorbed into the body immediately, but it takes time for it to heal. So therefore, afal pi shelo yatsa, even though the skin is not broken and it doesn't exude out of the body, nevertheless, it's still considered to be an act of chovel because you've dislodged the blood. So that's according to the Tana Kama, and on that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer ches shratzim yesh lehen oros. That no, all 8 shratzim have skin and are subject to chovel, and so you therefore see that even in Hilchas Shabbos, the Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri disagree. So Amar Ravashi man Tana Kama Rabbi Yehuda the Azul Basar Gishta. So the Gemara says no. This is not the same machlokus as Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim in the laws of Tumah Shratzim. This is a different machlokus. This is a machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rabbi Yehuda is a third Tana, is a third Shita. He holds that only 2 out of the 8 shratzim are subject to the law of chovel, and the reason is because he says that you look at the thickness of the sheritz's skin. Only if the sheretz has a thick skin do we say that its skin is distinct from the body and does not transmit tumah. And in the same vein, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that only animals with thick skin are subject to chovel. The Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, because the Chachamim's whole basis of distinguishing between one group of shratzim and another group of shratzim is based upon the identification of the pasuk, not based upon the physiology of the sheretz. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that all 8 shratzim, despite the thinness of their skin, still have skin that makes them subject to chovel and makes it such that their skin independently does not transmit tumah. Ditnan, as the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, haleta'a kechulda, that the lizard is like the weasel. Both of them have thick skins, and therefore their skins do not transmit tumah, and therefore they will be subject to chovel. Avol rabbanan depliga le Rabbi Yochanan le'inyan tumah le'inyan Shabbos modilei. But the Chachamim that we've mentioned before only disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri vis-a-vis the laws of tumah, but vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbos, they agree that all 8 shratzim are subject to the law of chovel, and therefore our Mishnah goes both according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim. The only person that our Mishnah cannot go like is Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi hai divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri?" Question mark. Divrei Rabbi Yochanan amachlu kasumi boilei. Then don't tell me in that brisa that the machlokus is only between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The machlokus is between Rabbi Yehuda on the one hand and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim on the other hand, as far as whether all 8 shratzim are subject to chovel or not. The Gemara says, you're right. Tani diver Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri umachlukasa. That's actually how you have to read the Brisa. When the Brisa says diver Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, it means Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and his band of colleagues. So, ba minei levi me Rebbe. Minayin lechabura sheino chozeres. How do you know that a true chabura, a true injury that we're referring to here in the context of the laws of chovel, is something that does not go back to its original place? Meaning that when blood is dislodged from its place, there's a bruise that develops. That blood does not return back to its original place. The answer is dichsiv hayahafoch kushi orov and amer chabar burosav. As it says in Yirmiyah, can a kushi, which is a man with black skin, a Negro, can a black man change his skin color? Similarly, can a leopard change its chabar buros, which normally means can it change its spots? My chabar burosav. So ilay medekoi rikmi, dekoi rikmi. If you tell me that it's referring to a leopard's spots, hai ben amer chabar burosav, namer gavanav mi boile. Then the language of chabar burosav, which implies injury, is not the appropriate term. It should have said, can a leopard change its colored spots, not can a leopard change its wounds or its injuries. So ela kikushi, ma oro dekushi eno chozeres, av chabura eno chozeres, but rather the word namer does not mean leopard, but rather namer is a verb. Can a person be minamer, change his injuries? Meaning injuries that are inflicted upon a person such that blood is dislodged, whether the skin is broken or not, is not something that immediately returns back to its original state. And that indicates that injuries that cause dislodging of blood are considered to be permanent, and that's why when you do an act of chovel, you're doing a malacha on Shabbos. Let us go on. Ushar shkatzim, we had said, and when it comes to other crawling creatures, we had said that if you are chovel them, then you're not doing a malacha because they don't have a proper skin. But if you trap them, then it depends on what your objective is. Ha horgan chayav. So the Gemara says the only time when we can agree that there's no malacha is when you only injure them but you don't kill them. By implication, by killing an insect, you are doing a malacha, because that's clearly netilas neshama, right? So the Gemara says, Mantana, who's the author of that statement? Amar Rav Yirmiyah Rabbi Eliezer. That's Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hahore kina b'Shabbos, kahore gamal b'Shabbos. That if you kill a louse, that's the singular for lice, if you kill a louse on Shabbos, that's tantamount to killing a camel. There's no difference. Both a louse and a camel have life in them, and if you snuff out that life, you've done a malacha. Doesn't matter what the size of the animal is. So maskefla Rav Yosef adkan lo pligi rabbanon alei de Rabbi Eliezer ela bikina deina para viraba aval sharshkatzim uramashim de param virabin lo pligi. So Rav Yosef says, why do you have to say that our Mishnah only goes like Rabbi Eliezer? The Chachamim don't disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. They agree that when you take an animal's or any creature's life, you're doing a malacha of killing the animal. The only species where they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer is specifically lice, because the Chachamim are of the opinion that there's no malacha of killing when you kill a lice on Shabbos, because lice do not reproduce in the way that other species do. Lice are spontaneously generated through perspiration, and they are not spawned through reproduction. Now, this, of course, is a controversial statement because we know scientifically that that's not the case. We don't have time to address this issue, but it's a very important discussion, which I think we've had a little bit in the past. But suffice it to say that the Chachamim's perception of reality is based on what the human eye detects, not what the microscope detects, and that translates into halachic rulings as well. So the Gemara now says, Ushneim lo limduha ela me'elim. Both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, even though they disagree with in the case of lice, the basis of their disagreement is from the same source. Because what is the source to teach me that killing an animal on Shabbos is a malacha? From the elim, from the rams that were killed in order to construct the Mishkan, because you killed rams in order to harvest their hides. Rabbi Eliezer Sover, Sovar Ke'ela Ma'ilam Sheish Bo Netilas Neshama Avkol Sheish Bo Netilas Neshama. Rabbi Eliezer says that rams are living creatures. So any living creature, irrespective of how they respond, is analogous to a ram, and therefore, just like killing a ram is a malacha, so too killing any living creature is a malacha, including lice. The Rabbanan Savri Ke'ela Ma'ilam Deparin V'Rabin Avkol Depara V'Rabba. And the Chachamim disagree, and they say that the analogy to a ram is that it has to be a type of creature that reproduces. But if the creature does not reproduce through parents, so then that's not analogous to the ram, and therefore, if you kill it, you're not liable for the malacha. Armalei Abaya Vikina in Para V'Rabba. So Abaya says, how can you suggest that lice do not reproduce? V'ha'amar mar Yoseph HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'zan mikarnei re'emim v'ad BAYT sekinim. Don't we have a famous statement by Chazal that say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so providential that he supervises the largest animal in the world, like the horns of the re'em, which is this huge mythical creature, down to the eggs of lice. So you see that Chazal acknowledged that lice lay eggs, and they do reproduce. So the Gemara says, no, minahu demikri BAYT sekinim. No, there's a species called lice, which reproduce through perspiration, and there's another species called BAYT sekinim. Not the eggs of lice, but rather eggs of lice. That's the name of the species of creature. Vehatanya tefuye BAYT sekinim. We have another brisa which seems to indicate the same thing, that tefuyin is a certain kind of insect, and BAYT sekinim also seems like eggs of lice. So Gemara answers there too, minahu demikri BAYT sekinim. It's a separate species called eggs of lice, not eggs of lice. Okay, so now the Gemara says, v'harei farosh depara v'rabba. So what are you going to say? Fleas do reproduce through eggs. We've seen that. B'tanya hatzad parosh b'Shabbos Rabbi Eliezer mechayev Rabbi Yeshua poter. And there's still a machlokus as far as trapping them, whether you're chayev or poter. So Amar Rav Ashi Seida Harika Karamis. He says, what's the question? You're creating a contradiction. Well, we're talking about apples and oranges. One is trapping and one is killing. Arkan lo pligi Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua el demar saver davar shein b'mino nitzav chayev b'mar saver poter. That the machlokus there between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is, if you trap a species which is not normally trapped, are you doing a malacha or not? However, that's got nothing to do with killing the animal. But when it comes to killing, even Rabbi Yeshua agrees that if you kill a creature on Shabbos, even though it's not normally trapped, you're going to be chayav for netilas neshama. Let's go on. Hatzadan letzorech chayav v'chulei. That if you trap an animal that's not normally trapped, then it depends what your objective is. If your objective is to harvest the animal for some purposeful use, so then you've done a malacha. And if you're doing it just to protect yourself and to ward it off, because you hate bugs or whatever it is, so then you're putter. You haven't done the malacha. So Mantana, who's the author of our Mishnah, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Reb Shimon Hidamar Malacha Shein Tzricha Lagufa Pater Aleha. That is only according to Reb Shimon, because according to Reb Yehuda, even when I do a malacha for the not for the designated normative objective, I'm still chayiv. We've learned this multiple times already. So therefore, our Mishnah, which says that as long as I'm not doing the malacha for this normative designated objective, I'm pater. That's only according to Reb Shimon. So ika damasni la aha. Some say that statement of Rav Yehuda Marav was referring to another case of hamefis morsa b'Shabbos. If a person squeezes a pimple on Shabbos, im lasos la pechayv im lahotzi mimena leicha pater. If it's to create an aperture to allow air circulation into the pimple or the boil, so then you're going to be chayiv because you're doing an act of boina, you're doing an act of construction. But if it's only to get out the pus, so then you're going to be pater. So Mantana, who's the author of that? Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav, Reb Shimon Hidamar Malacha Shein Tzricha Lagufa Pater Aleha. That's only true according to Reb Shimon, who says that as long as even if you're creating an aperture, you're doing an act of construction, but it's not for that designated purpose, but rather if it's from side objective, that's a Malacha Shein Tzricha Lagufa, and therefore you're going to be pater. V'ika damasni la'aha. Some say that statement of Rab was going on the following, that Hatzad Nachash b'Shabbos misasek bo shelo yishachenu pater im l'refuah chayev. That if a person traps a snake on Shabbos, if he's doing it to avoid being bitten by the snake, so then you're potter. But if you're doing it because you want to trap the snake so you can harvest its venom for therapeutic purposes, so then you're chayiv. Mantana, who says you're potter when you trap the snake for protection? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rabbi Shimon Hidar Mamlecha Shin Tzrich Lagufa Potter Aleh. Same principle. That since you're not trapping it for the sake of getting the benefit from the animal, but rather for a side benefit of just avoiding the danger of the animal, so then it's a malacha shen tzricha leguf, and only according to Reb Shimon are you potter. Amar Shmuel, Hashol dag min hayam, kivin sheyovesh bo kesel chayev. Now we know that killing any creature on Shabbos makes you chayev for netilas neshama, for killing an animal. What about fish? So that it applies to fish as well. If you have, let's say, a net that's been sitting in the pond or the lake from before Shabbos, and you've got fish that have been trapped in there, just by pulling up the net and pulling out a fish, you're doing a malacha on Shabbos. And at what point do you become chayev? You become chayev when the fish's skin has dried out enough so that the size of a sela coin of the skin of fish's skin is now completely dry. That's at that point you're chayev. The point is that even though you don't kill it immediately upon pulling it out from the water, but nevertheless you're going to be chayev if you let it lay out long enough so that it dies. And what's the definition of death for a fish? That a sela size of its skin coverage is dry. Amar Avasi bar Abin ubein sinapirav. But that's provided that that dry area is between its fins. Amar Avashi lo tema yavesh mamish elafilu de'avad riri. And that it doesn't have to be mamish dry to the touch, but even if it's just a little slimy, so that you feel something, there's still a little bit of moisture there, but it's considered to be dry so that it's slimy now, it's not wet anymore, that also is considered to be dry, and the fish is now dead. Amar Mar Bar Hamduri, Amar Shmuel, Hoshit Yadu Lamei Behema Vidil Del Uber Shebeme'eha Chayev. A related issue. If a person were to go over to a pregnant mammal and insert his hand into the uterus of the animal and dislodge the fetus from the placenta or from the uterine wall in some way that he causes the abortion of the fetus, so then you've done a malacha on Shabbos. Now what malacha have you done? So one could argue that it's netilas neshama, that you're killing an animal. However, that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says it's Amarava Bar Hamduri, Amarava Bar Hamduri Asberali, Lav Amarav Sheishes, Haiman Detalish Kshusa Mehizme Vihigi Mechayv Mishum Oker Davar Migidulo, Hachanami Mechayv Mishum Oker Davar Migidulo. He cites an example that has to do with the vegetable kingdom, not the animal kingdom. In the vegetable kingdom, if a person uproots hops from the thorns and thistles from which it's growing, he's done a malacha. There he's done a malacha of kotzer, because even though perhaps one could argue that the hops do not actually grow from the thorns, but that is their natural habitat, anytime you uproot something from its natural habitat, you're doing an act of kotzer and you've done a malacha. And the same thing is true when you dislodge a fetus from its place of nourishment and growth and life source, you've done an act of kotzer. Why doesn't the Gemara just say that it's netilas neshama? It sounds like because, and again I haven't researched this thoroughly, but it sounds like it's because since the animal is still in utero, it's not considered to be a life vis-a-vis the laws of Melecha Shabbos. Now, Amar Abaye, Haiman de Tolash Pitra mi una de chatzva michayev mishum oker davar migidula. In a similar vein, if a person were to find mushrooms growing, a fungus growing on the side of a pail, and he were to remove the mushrooms from off the side of the pail, then he would also be chayev because of oker davar migidulo. Now there, it's an act of kotzer, even though the mushroom spores grow from the air, they don't grow from anything that's nourishing them from the ground. But since that's their natural habitat and they cannot thrive unless they are attached to that place, that's still considered to be a malacha of kotzer. So Maser Rav Oshia Atolish Me'otz It's Nakuv Chayvish and Nakuv Potter. So Rav Oshia challenges that. He says, if I have a flower pot that doesn't have holes in it, and it's completely not connected to the soil, and is not being nourished from the soil, that by lifting it up from the ground, I'm not doing a malacha. So why, by lifting a mushroom off of the side of the pail that's moist and cool, am I doing a malacha? So the answer is, Hasam lav haina rebise, hacha haina rebise. The answer is that when you lift a flower pot off the ground, you're not in any way retarding its growth. But now that you've removed the mushroom off of the place where it thrives, you're retarding its growth, and that in itself constitutes an act of kotzer. I don't know if we paskin this way, but that at least is what the Gemara's position is at this point. Have a wonderful Shabbos.